Good evening, and welcome to An Evening with William Landay. I'm Magdalene Moran. I'm chair of Brookline Reads 2014. This is a program that's been going on in Brookline for about 10 years now, and the goal is really to foster community. It's to bring people like yourselves together for discussion, to promote literacy, and to promote interaction within our town. We had a wonderful panel discussion on the 24th, where a number of experts that we brought in talked about some of the themes from Mr. Landay's book, including this idea of a murder gene, juvenile justice. And we hope to hear some more this evening from Mr. Landay about those topics, but also about how he transitioned from being an assistant district attorney to being a writer. So before I go on, I should really thank the Brookline Reads panel. It's a wonderful team that is putting on this event tonight. Karen Livingston, chair of the library trustees. Reggie Healy, Karen Troy and Lowy, Kristen Ugerman, Kate Tiebold, Hank Philippi Ryan, the journalist, was also part of the panel. Myself, originally Roberta Winitzer, who's the chair of past Brookline Reads events. And I hope I didn't forget anybody. And Ann Reed, of course, who's the assistant director at the library. We're thrilled to have William Landay here tonight. I think many of you know he actually grew up in Brookline. He grew up around the block from here, and it was around the block from where his father grew up. He attended the Heath School before moving on to Roxbury Latin. He was a Yale undergrad and got his law degree from BC, after which he was an assistant Middlesex DA for most of the 1990s. In 2001, he sold his first book, which was Mission Flats, and Defending Jacob, which is what he's here to talk to us about tonight, has been critically acclaimed. It was a New York Times bestseller and an Amazon Pick of the Month, and I'd be thrilled if you joined me in welcoming William Landay.
I have Magdalene's notes here.
Yeah, in case you don't know where you came from.
In case I forget who I am. Thank you for having me. This is very flattering and touching. The whole thing with Defending Jacob has been an amazing ride, but to have this event here in Brookline is really moving for me. Graham Greene said that an author's childhood is his bank account. And so I do feel as if I owe a lot to Brookline and feel at home here in a way that I don't in other places, because this is where I spent my childhood. And so I'm very touched and happy to be here tonight. I'll tell you a story. When I started at the Middlesex DA's office, I was fresh out of law school. This was 1990. And my first assignment was in Lowell District Court. And that to me was a plum assignment, because when you get out of law school at that point, what you want is to try cases. You want to get into the courtroom as quickly and as often as you can, and Lowell was where the action is. So I was thrilled with that assignment, and what I didn't know when I went up there was that not only did Lowell have a lot of crime at the time, but it also had a lot of stories. It had a lot of personality in its crime. At the time, I wasn't planning on becoming a writer. It never really crossed my mind as I was growing up that you could be a writer. There were no writers in my life. There were no artists of any kind, really. And so I never thought that you could make a living doing this. I'm still not sure that most people can make a living doing this. So if you're considering this, I would think twice if I were you. But I had got it in my head at the time that I did want to give it a try. Not to be a novelist, but to write one novel. I wanted to see my name on the front of a book. I wanted to check that off the bucket list, and then I would go and get a real job and pay the bills. So at the time, when I started at the DA's office and when I was sent up to Lowell, I was writing what seemed to me to be the kind of books that young men ought to write, which was novels about the exquisite angst of being young Bill Landay. And As you might imagine, there's not much of a market for this. So I'm sent to Lowell. I get thrown in, and just to give you a flavor of Lowell District Court at the time, I start on Tuesday morning after Labor Day. And to celebrate Labor Day in the fall of, this would be 1991, the Lowell Police Department arrested the entire city of Lowell. And so what they do is they bring in all the arrests for the weekend. The holding cell in Lowell is in the basement of the courthouse. And they bring the arrests up one by one to be arraigned, to have the charges read, and to have bail set. And this is what the first session is. And every person that they brought up had a story. And one guy that they brought up, his story was this. Lowell is a big boxing town. Yeah, there's a big Gold Gloves tournament there. This guy had been a former Gold Gloves champion. He had boxed professionally, briefly, without much success. But his claim to fame as a boxer was he was the only man who ever knocked down Sugar Ray Leonard. That was the story about him. That was his reputation. This was the only man who ever knocked down Sugar Ray Leonard. He had become an addict and a drunk, and this poor guy, every time he walked into a bar, which was frequently, somebody would take a swing at him, because everybody wanted to test the guy who was the only man to knock down Sugar Ray Leonard. I knew that was a story. I knew that was a story the moment I heard that phrase, the only man to knock down Sugar Ray Leonard. But it still hadn't occurred to me to start writing crime. And I see your brains racing ahead, and this was the man that Christian Bale played in The Fighter, and won the Oscar for playing that role. At the time, however, the idea of writing stories set in Lowell and about the crime scene in Lowell was unheard of. And yet here I was every day seeing stories like this. Another story on Lowell. There was one morning I walked in and the courthouse was buzzing, and they had arrested a man whose reputation on the street was that he was a man who had no mouth. And the story was that he had tried to commit suicide by shooting up through his jaw, and he had flinched. And somehow he blew the jawbone off of his head, and this left him with no mouth. Now, I never saw the man with no mouth because I was sent out to try one of my very important trespassing cases, so I missed him. But that phrase, like the only man to knock down Sugar Ray Leonard, the man who had no mouth, was something that gets in your head, and you start to embellish on that. So it occurred to me, belatedly, after writing a few awful novels about the exquisite angst of being young Bill Landay, that, hey, maybe I ought to write about this stuff. So I started writing crime novels. But remember, it was neither my intention to be a novelist, nor my intention to write about crime. Actually, what happened, I'll say this because friends of mine are in the audience, and so I know this will get back to my wife if I tell you this story. A girl I was seeing at the time, who was a loon and should not have been giving career advice at all, was at a party, and somebody said to her, when she told him that her boyfriend wanted to be a writer, and this guy worked in publishing in some capacity, and he said to her, oh, he should write to a genre. That was the advice. So that was why I started to write these genre novels. Why? Because somebody said to my girlfriend at a party, this is the equivalent now of I read it on the internet. It seemed like a good idea at the time. So I started writing these crime novels while I was trying cases as an assistant DA during the week. As it went along, I wound up leaving the DA's office to write my books. And what I would do is I would pull out my retirement money, and I would take a leave from the office, and I would write a book. And when the book either died or the money ran out, I would go back and start up as an assistant DA again. And so this is how I went through the 90s, and it's a very public way to do your apprenticeship, because the entire office knows that you're trying to do this. So if you fail, everybody will realize this. And it turned out I was failing, really. I mean, the books didn't sell well enough, and the idea of just seeing my name on the front of a book ceased to satisfy me. What happens is you start off thinking, well, I just want to write a book that's good enough to publish. Put my name on the front of it and I'll check that off and move on. But as you do it, and as you learn more and more, well, then it's not enough just to see your book published. It's not enough just to write any book. It has to be a good book. And so I kept churning out manuscript after manuscript, and nothing was happening. I was about to give up because in the interim, I got married, which doesn't change much, honestly. But what does change much is you have a kid. And my wife was pregnant with my older son. I have two boys, Henry and Ted. They're 12 and 10 now. My wife was pregnant with my first child, Ted. And we had gone to the doctor's office for the ultrasound. And that's where we were when the call came in saying that my first novel, Mission Flats, had sold. But at that point, I was just about to give up on this whole idea of writing, which had never seemed particularly realistic to me at all. So my first novel, Mission Flats, it begins with a man who has no mouth, and it draws on a lot of these stories that were coming up in Lowell in particular, but throughout Middlesex County and Boston generally. And so it was kind of a weaving together of all of this material that I was seeing. That was a crime novel. A funny thing happens, you write a crime novel, people start talking about you as a crime novelist, and that seemed to be the brand that I had. And so my second novel, I wrote another crime novel. And I don't mean to look down my nose at crime novels. I love them and I read them and choose to write them, and I don't feel the least bit constrained by it. The reason that people write about crime is it's a dramatic, effective way to talk about anything that you want. It's a prism that you can use to dramatize any kind of human experience. So I never felt constrained by that at all. But when it came time to write my third novel, the book that became Defending Jacob, at this point I had been typecast as a crime novelist in a way that I never intended and never felt entirely comfortable doing. However, unimaginative author that I was, I proposed to my editor to write a third novel. The second book was called The Strangler. It was about the Boston crime scene in the early 60s, when Boston was a much grittier and more rough and tumble kind of place. And I wanted to follow that up with a book set in the Boston crime world in the 70s. And it was going to be about the combat zone. It was going to be about the rise of Whitey Bulger. It was going to be about Jerry Angiulo and his rise and fall. And that was my pitch. And I was convinced that this was a winner. I love this idea of the combat zone. And if you grew up in Boston at the time I did, the combat zone was always a glamorous, dangerous place. And the concept of the combat zone, the concept that we would have an area right in downtown Boston that would be a lawless zone, that we would have Dodge City right in the middle of downtown Boston, was fascinating to me. I couldn't get over it. So I thought this was a keeper. I pitched this book to my editor, and I get a call from my agent. Kate says she wants you to come down to New York and talk about this. And I'll tell you two things about this call. When it's good news, the editor calls. When it's bad news, she calls the agent, and then the agent calls you. The other thing about this was, if it's good news, you talk on the phone. If she's calling you down to talk at the Random House office, nothing good comes after that. So I go down to Random House in New York, and this was 2007 or so. And to tell you how times have changed, my editor and I had breakfast in the Random House dining room. Imagine this. Just let those words roll around in your head for a minute. The Random House dining room. I promise you there is no such thing anymore. It was this room that overlooked Broadway, waiters in white jackets, a kitchen. There was nobody else there except my editor and me, and yet they presented us menus, and there was a full kitchen there to make us whatever we wanted. We have this, and first of all, I don't know what she expected, that she thought that she needed to make this big production. She was going to tell me that she didn't want to buy the book. I guess she thought I was going to jump out the window or something. She felt like she needed security there. We have breakfast at this, in this dining room, and she tells me, you know, to be honest, you can write any book you want, and we'll buy it. But I have to tell you that if you write a book called The Combat Zone, most readers, mainstream readers, aren't even going to give that book a chance. We would like to break you out to a wider audience, but if you choose to write a book like this, we just can't do it, because most readers won't go down that aisle in the bookstore. It doesn't matter how brilliantly the book is written, it doesn't matter how well executed the idea is, they just aren't interested in reading about a place called the Combat Zone. And so she suggested to me, go back to your own life. Write a book that's more personal to you, that's closer to your own experience. And so that is really how Defending Jacob started. She put me back on the train to Boston, and as I was coming back, I started to plan this book. And the way the book began, honestly, was in one of the storylines that was from that earlier book. It was a storyline about a cop who was the son and father of murderers. And that, in turn, was based on a real story. It happened in New York. It was around 1990. It was the subject of a well-known Esquire magazine article by a reporter named Mike McAlary. And I'll just tell you briefly about this. In the real case, the cop who was the son of the murderer, he grew up in a little beach town in Long Island, a resort town. His father had been convicted of murder, but the facts of the murder were a little ambiguous morally. He and another guy had kidnapped a young child from a wealthy family. They were going to hold this boy for ransom, and so they had every incentive to keep the boy alive and well. But in spiriting the boy away from his home, they threw him in the backseat of a car, threw a blanket over him, and the other man held the kid down to keep him out of sight and to keep him quiet, and they wound up smothering the boy. That in criminal law is called felony murder. Doesn't matter that it's an unintentional killing, it's a murder that takes place during the course of a felony. The felony is kidnapping, and that makes it first-degree murder. So he's convicted of first-degree murder, and this man's son grows up under that shadow. He becomes a straight arrow, much like Andy Barber, becomes the lead homicide detective in this little town. He has a son. So the third generation, the Jacob Barber in this story, the son is no good and is a drug addict, and he commits a truly gruesome murder. Murders his girlfriend, the body is found on the beach. The detective, because he's unaware of the connection, takes the case. He's the lead homicide detective in this town. He winds up investigating his own son. Mike McAlary interviews the son, the boy, but the kid said to him was, "Look at my family. I have the murder gene." And that was the first time I had heard that phrase, the murder gene. And keep in mind, when this interview is happening, it's the early 1990s. We haven't decoded the human genome. The phrase, the murder gene, has no scientific meaning at all. He's just using it as shorthand. He's using it as a way to say, I inherited a mean streak, I inherited a criminal streak, a violent streak. But it was a phrase that stuck with me. And these ideas stick with you for years, and your mind plays with them. And so this story, I had embedded into this combat zone book. And when I decided to cannibalize that book for stories to tell in what became Defending Jacob, it was a matter of transmuting that story into a story that was closer to my own life and my own history. And so it became not about a cop, but about a lawyer. It became about a lawyer who worked in the very office where I worked, who lives in a house that looks an awful lot like my house. It's a real burst of creativity. He drives a minivan that's very much like the minivan I'm going to drive home in after this event. And this is how the story came together. And it was a new way to write for me. I'm sort of I know you can't tell right now, but I'm a shy person. I don't like to use my own life in my books, and so writing about crime had actually been very comfortable for me because the fact that it was further from my own experience in a way made it easier for me to do it because things were more arm's length. Writing a story that was closer to my own life in a way was harder, but I do think it added some depth to the story. What's interesting about that story that I drew on, and by the way, that magazine article, the case became the magazine article in Esquire. The magazine article in Esquire became a movie. I don't know if you remember, it's called City by the Sea. It has Robert De Niro, a very young James Franco, who's brilliant in this movie. Frances McDormand is in it. It's an amazing cast. It's an amazing cast, but it's kind of a lousy movie. I hope the screenwriter is not here. I'll tell you why it's a lousy movie. They made a critical change in the story, and that is they changed the son's murder, the third generation, the Jacob Barber. They changed that murder to self-defense. And in the movie, James Franco, who plays the young son, is an addict. His dealer's name is Snake. He owes money to Snake, and Snake attacks him, and James Franco is forced to kill this man. So I'll give you the one ironclad rule of interpreting movies. If there is a murder and the victim's name is Snake, the murder is justified 100% of the time. But I saw that and I thought, that is so much less interesting than the original story. Because in the original story, what made the story so poignant and so interesting to me was that this father, this cop, had tried to create such a clean break from his criminal past, from his patrimony. And it came roaring back in a way that he couldn't have anticipated and couldn't possibly have prevented. He was a good parent who did everything right. And yet. What made it personal to me at that point was by then I had two sons. They're 12 and 10 now, so I guess they were 7 and 5 at the time, or thereabouts. So this idea of what a good parent does and what are the limits of what a good parent can do was a live issue for me, as it is for every young parent. You know, my generation is ridiculed, and rightly so, for helicopter parenting, for over-involvement in our kids' lives, for never missing a Little League game. And we do all of these ridiculous things. And I think the assumption that we all make is that it matters. That if we become more involved, that if we are better parents, that will make it more likely that we'll produce better children. It will increase the odds. And it just isn't necessarily so. It just isn't necessarily so. There is such a thing as bad parenting, and obviously I don't recommend that, but good parenting is no guarantee. And one thing that I hadn't quite appreciated before I became a parent is the element of chance in this and the anxiety that that causes. We are very comfortable during the 9 months of a pregnancy in talking about wanting a healthy child. My mother likes to say we want a baby with 10 fingers and 10 toes. That's her shorthand for it. But there's another kind of anxiety that we don't like to think about, and that's that we don't know who this little person is. We're bringing this new person into our life, and in a way this is the most important, most enduring relationship that we'll ever have, because you can't divorce your child. And yet you don't get to meet this person before you introduce him into your family. And so you have this anxiety that is unspoken. So that's how Defending Jacob began. It was really a way to marry all of these stories and to bring to it a lot of the worries and the anxieties that I was feeling as a young father. Andy Barber was a great vehicle for this, because as you think about it, what a prosecutor does parallels very nicely with what a parent does. What the criminal law is doing is, by a system of carrots and sticks, it's trying to inculcate proper behavior in people. It's trying to get people to behave in approved ways, and that is exactly what parents do. The other thing that was interesting about this that happened organically and in an unanticipated way was that during the years between the time I had first encountered that story about the murder gene, the science had really caught up to that phrase. We had decoded the human genome. We had begun to study the science of what influences human behavior, and particularly violent behavior. We now had the tools to talk about this in an intelligent way, and that was something that was entirely unanticipated by me, and obviously gives the book a depth that it wouldn't otherwise have had. A lot of people ask me about the science of the book and how accurate it is, and I'll tell you, it is as accurate as I could make it. The MAOA gene is entirely real. I did change some things about it. But I changed as little as I could in order to write the story that I wanted to write. So yes, the science is accurate, and the law is accurate as well. And the idea was to keep this book as close to reality as we could. I'll tell you, as I was writing it, in fact, I was uncomfortable setting the book in the town where I actually live, in Newton. I wasn't sure how my fellow Newtonites were going to take that. So when I made various attempts to fictionalize the town, and one of the fictional Newtons that I came up with was a town called Newtown. And I had never heard of Newtown, Connecticut at the time, but for a while that was the name of the town that I used in the book. There was no reason to change from it. The shootings in Newtown didn't happen until much later, obviously. The only reason I changed was that fictionalizing the city made it feel inauthentic to me, and a little less sincere and heartfelt to me. I have this idea that books are a unique art form, because you can't receive them passively the way you're doing now. It's not like a movie or a TV show or a play or music where you can sit there and receive it as it comes to you. A book arrives as 300 pages of code on a page of squiggly black lines, and you bring to it your skill as a reader. It's up to you to lift those words up off the page and perform the book for yourself inside your head. That is a very intimate way to experience a story, and it's why people feel a very close connection with authors. It's why people come up to me and feel a connection with this person that they have never met. I have been inside their head in a way, and that establishes an intimacy. In any event, my theory is that if you are writing well, if you are truly in the moment and feeling it when you write, then the prose will be alive. That life will be coded into those words, and when the reader comes to that book, either on the day it's published or 50 years down the road, when the reader opens up that book and starts to pull those words up and perform it in her head, she will sense that authenticity, that living quality, and if the book works. And so I wanted to, in the moment of writing, feel that this was as close to my experience as I could make it, so that the reader would have that vivid experience when she came to the book. Doesn't always work. Doesn't always work for all readers. We've all had that experience of opening up a book and having it never come to life. No matter how skilled a reader we are, no matter how badly we want it to work, some books just never come up off the page. But I do feel that if a book has that sense of life, then you'll find it. In any event, the book, I'll tell you, the book took off even before it was finished, honestly. I had never, this was my third book. My previous two had been well reviewed, and yet never sold, really. And so I had never experienced anything like what happened with this book. And I'll tell you, it's a surreal experience, because the writing, the experience of writing the book is done in complete solitude. Even if you are sitting in a crowded Starbucks typing away on your laptop, you are as alone as you could be if you were on the dark side of the moon. And you write it in solitude, and it is consumed in solitude as well. The reader, even if she's sitting in a crowded Starbucks, is alone in experiencing that story. So to me, this is what writing is. It's a solitary experience. And yet this book took off and became a very public, very social experience even before it was done. There was a buzz that started within Random House, within a very small, tight circle, and it grew in concentric circles as it went out and out. My editor read it. You have a round of copy editors who read it, and then salespeople, and then reps out in the field, and we kept getting this electric response to it. The woman who runs the publishing house, and this is when I knew we had something, the woman who runs the publishing house had brought it home to read over the weekend, and it was Sunday night around dinner time, and her kids were going crazy, and her house was too loud, and so she took the book, the manuscript, the loose pages, got in her car and drove to the local supermarket, and she sat in the parking lot in her car and she read the book. And when I read that, I thought, all right, well now we might have something. And so that's really how it happened. I had never been the focus of this kind of promotional effort. I was on doing book tours before the book had even been published. This was another aspect of the business that I was completely unaware of before. You go out on a tour to meet booksellers. And the idea is not just to build buzz, which intuitively makes sense, but also to build pre-orders, which I didn't get. And the beauty of pre-orders is that they all register on the date of publication. So if you can build up pre-orders, then they'll register right away, and you have a chance of spiking your book up onto the bestseller list and being noticed. So this was a wonderful thing, and that is pretty much how it happened. The book went to #1 on the Barnes & Noble website by lunchtime on that first day, and it stayed there for the better part of a week. The movie rights were sold, and it's all been this surreal experience. Even the movie rights, which sounds like it's going to be this big glamorous thing that you're involved in from the start. What was happening was I was at home on a Friday night with my kids. We do family movie night on Friday nights. And so at 9 o'clock, we're watching a movie, the phone rings, and no one had even told me that this was going on. And they say, oh, the deal is closing right now. You know, can you talk? And this is when I learned that the book had been sold, optioned for movies. So what's funny about being a writer, you know, people keep saying, well, what's it like to have a book take off like this? And what it's like is strange because you're not really involved. The book is out there and it's having this incredible public life. But you're still sitting alone in your office trying to churn out the next book. And so it's been a strange experience and a great experience. So I'll leave it at that. This is the kind of book that people tend to want to talk about. It's a good book club book for that reason. Has everybody here read the book? Most people read the book? Anybody read the book? Oh my. Okay, I won't, I guess there's a few here, so I suppose we should avoid spoilers in our Q&A, but let's try to at least be a little considerate for people who have not read it. It is one of those books that it helps to not know where it's going. But I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. There are apparently microphones set up, and so you can go to the microphone. If you want to just ask, I can repeat the question for everybody. Okay, go for it.
Hi, I'm just wondering how you came up with that title, Defending Jacob.
How we came up with the title? I'll tell you how we came up with the title. I didn't come up with the title. We went through, well, I'll tell you, when I write, I submit a proposal or an outline, and then I submit to my editor at page 50, page 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. A 300-page book is about a 500-page manuscript. Every one of those submissions had a different title. We could not figure out what to call this. And in fact, at one point, my editor took a survey at Random House of people who had read it. And she said, well, here's the list. And she sent me this Word document that had 100 suggestions on it. Most of them were phrases that had been pulled from the book, and 100 might as well be 0, because where do you even start? So we went through, and we couldn't settle on anything. My editor, as I was doing my last rewrite, said, I know what the title is, but I'm not going to tell you until you finish that last rewrite. I'm a procrastinator, so she's managing me. So we finish it. I finish it, and I finished it around 3 in the morning. And so I emailed her the document, and I thought, well, at least I get the day off. And it turns out my editor, well, I knew this. I didn't think she'd be awake then, but she's a bit of a loop. She wakes up at about 3 in the morning. She lives in New Jersey, but rural New Jersey. And she comes in on the bus to avoid traffic. She has a light that she puts on her head like a miner's light. And she rides the bus into New York and she reads her manuscripts with this light. And then she leaves to go home at around 2 in the afternoon. So I send her the book at 3 in the morning, and bang, before I can even get the computer turned off, the email comes back and she says it's called Defending Jacob. And by that time, it was 3 in the morning and I'd been working around the clock to finish this thing. So I was like, fuck it, call it whatever you want, I don't care. So, now it's had this title. And so, it's like when you name your kid. We named my son, we named Ted. I wanted to name him Joe. But we didn't go with Joe. We went with Ted, and now he can only be Ted. But if we named him Joe, then he could only have been Joe. It's the same here. Defending Jacob seems like the only possible, inevitable title, and yet it's all arbitrary.
It's a great title.
Thank you.
Thank you. William, I really loved your book. For me, the central focus of the book was the father's dilemma. And I just want to bring your attention to an observation I have as an American Muslim. Not too long ago, I was touring Morocco, And whilst in Casablanca, I noticed that almost every boulevard has a monument or a board that says Allah al-Malik al-Watan, which means God, King, and country. And the people there were like, justice must always be done, no matter what sacrifice. And in the same light, I think recently you may have heard that the Saudi monarch actually sanctioned the execution of one of the crown princes because he was guilty of murder. And he said that the Sharia that applies to the common man must also apply to the royal family. In stark contrast to that, when I have had conversations with my American friends in this country, they tell me that their absolute and ultimate loyalty is for their spouse or their child. And if it ever came that they were on the line, they would transgress against the country, against perhaps their own brand of Christianity, because that is what their loyalty lies with. I'm not saying that this is a sweeping way it works, but do you think that just this observation sort of makes the dilemma of your book a very particularly and poignantly American one?
I don't know. I don't know if I can speak to the cross-cultural question, only because I'm not familiar enough with these foreign cultures. I have gone in my life from Brookline to Newton, so I am not the person to ask about this. But what I can say is that, and I presume this is a universal experience, all parents have this dual role of trying to be a good parent, in the sense of trying to be as loyal and supportive and devoted to your child as you can be, and also having a public role of trying to be a good citizen. And obviously we all owe some debt of loyalty to our neighbors to see that the law is applied, and that if there is some dangerous condition, that people are protected from it, including dangerous people. And so for most of us, those two roles as good parent and good citizen will never conflict. And so by being a good parent, you are being a good citizen. What happens here is that those roles do conflict. And I don't know that there's any easy answer to it. I tried to toy with it a little bit in the sense that the book reverses the gender stereotypes a little bit, in that what you might expect is that the mother would be the parent who would never leave her child's side no matter what. And the father might be a little more objective, a little more distant. Here those roles are reversed. And Andy, as a lawyer and a prosecutor, is in a particularly poignant and informed position to play that role. But I will say that, and by the way, that was not so much a tactical decision. It was just, you know, I was writing about fathers and sons. And I was writing from the position of a father with two sons. And honestly, coming from a father-son relationship myself, that is not ideal. And so to me, you know, that flaw of being overly devoted to your child didn't seem to me like a flaw at all. To me, and I don't mean this in some sort of generalized way or in a uniquely American way, but just personally, I just thought, well, you know, who wouldn't want a father like that? Who wouldn't want a father that sticks with you right to the end, right or wrong? And so that was really just more of a personal reflection than anything else. And so it's a very interesting question. And what it makes me wonder is whether the book reads differently if you are from a country that, wherever you are, whatever cultural influences cause you to perceive these characters differently. Even in this country, what I found is that different readers will stick with the Barbers to different points. For example, throwing away the knife or destroying the iPod, whatever it is, there's always a breaking point that somebody says, well, that's too far. I couldn't go that way. And then someone else in the room will say, well, of course I'd go that far. And it's interesting to think that maybe in different countries there is a different way to think about those things. I don't know what the cultural influence would be. I remember one point I did a reading, and one woman stood up and she made exactly that point. I think it was about throwing away the knife. And she said, no parent would ever do that. It's going too far. And there was a cop in the audience who was a state trooper. He'd been in one of these CPAC units, the units that were assigned to the DA's office, and that are the lead units in these in a homicide investigation. And so he spent 20 or 30 years doing murder investigations, and he stood up and he said, well, of course I'd get rid of it. So you never know. There's a lot of personal idiosyncrasy that goes into these two. So thank you. That was a very long answer to a very short question.
Hi. I was about 3/4 of the way through the book this week when the headlines came out with the interview in the New Yorker with Adam Lanza's father, the New Shooter. Sorry. Should I read the whole thing? Yeah. I was about 3/4 of the way through the book when the interview came out this week with Adam Lanza's father, the Newtown shooter, where he said he wished that his son had never been born. And it struck me, since I was very close to the end of your book, about the feelings that the fathers were having, and I was just wondering how those headlines struck you and how you might have felt about how Andy may have felt in this situation or something like that.
That is such a poignant thing for a father to say. Your heart sinks when you even hear that quote. You know, when I hear that, it's very difficult to hear. I can't imagine as a father ever getting to the point where I could say that about my children. I wish you had never been born.
And part of me, as I'm listening to that,
Yeah.
made me wonder if I was thinking through the end of the book if Jacob's mother was fighting with that feeling
Right.
as well.
Right. I think, and again, you know, trust the art, not the artist. I don't know what all of these characters necessarily would have believed. Your interpretation of these characters, in some ways, is as valid as mine. As I stand here now, I find it very hard to believe that Andy Barber could ever say those words, no matter what. He's just not wired that way, and he has steeled himself. He's become a very strong person because of what he's been through. You know, he is in the position of having a law and order sort of job and a law and order sort of sensibility. And yet, because of what he's been through with his father, I just don't know that he could ever bring himself to say those words.
Thank you.
I want to make a comment about what you said. I think there's a difference between wishing he was never born and saying you're glad he's dead. I mean, that would be,
Yes.
to me, that's much harsher. But the comment I wanted to make was that I was 3/4 of the way through the book when someone told me the ending. No, and it turned out that I enjoyed reading it more then. The trial became much more interesting for me because it wasn't so much waiting to see what was going to happen, but actually being involved with the process.
Right.
And so it really became exciting. My question is, the title. I had to keep telling everyone that this book was not a biblical story. Whenever anybody wanted to read it, I would have to say, no, it has nothing to do with Jacob in the Bible. And so that's why I wondered about the title, because most people think, oh, I don't feel like reading. No, it's got nothing to do with that. So I just, I wondered whether that came up in the discussion with your editor, and whether you chose the name Jacob, thinking that was going to go.
I didn't choose the name for any religious overtones. In fact, the religious overtones are a reason not to choose that name, precisely because they are distracting and they point readers in the wrong direction. But naming characters is very, very, very difficult. And when you are choosing names, you're trying to find names that evoke something in your reader that is appropriate to the character. And again, this is all subjective, so there's nothing particular about the name Jacob that will trigger the right associations in a reader, because not all readers will bring the same attitudes to it. But again, it's about feeling and making the aesthetic choice as you're writing that name suits him. And again, this is more art than science. And choosing names in particular is like that. So the name LeJudas was chosen because I wanted a name that felt slippery and mealy-mouthed, and it was hard to pronounce. The name Barber was chosen only because I have a friend named Ted Barber, and everybody loves Ted Barber. If Ted Barber came in the room, you would love Ted Barber. And so I wanted people to feel the same way about Andy, and so I had to feel that way as I was writing it. So go ahead, yes.
Did you choose the mother to be Jewish on purpose?
No,
Not
no. I'm Jewish. My wife is Jewish, so. Yeah. Again, it's funny, you know, the characters, I've never had the experience that some writers describe, which is that the characters come to life and they, you know, the action starts taking place on a movie screen ahead of me and I just have to write fast enough to get it all down. That's never happened to me. It's always much harder than that. But what does happen is as you're going along, you're shaping these characters, and so you grab details, whether they're physical details, religion, background, whatever it might be that seems right for that character as you're trying to build her out. And a lot of times it's just associations with people that you know, and so you're drawing on personal connections that won't necessarily have any resonance for readers generally, but have that association for you. So again, more art than science.
I had heard that the book was loosely based on a case in Sudbury or some such place, and I had also heard that the defense attorney was based on a specific person, and it occurs to me that Andy Barber probably is based to some extent on you and your experiences. So I was wondering how much you use, and you talked in other instances about using ideas that came from your observations. I was wondering to what extent that's important in your writing.
Sure. Well, I'll take those in order. I try never to draw explicitly on any particular case. And so there have been many cases, several, like the one you mentioned, that are similar to this, that affected it and that I pulled details from, but I try never to use them precisely because I feel it's very sensitive to write about crime. And it's very sensitive to write about actual criminal cases. Crime victims don't volunteer for their public role. And so I never want to feel as if I'm exploiting the cases that are out there. At the same time, you want to be sensitive to victims, and yet as a writer, you necessarily are affected by what you're hearing and reading and finding out about. And so you're always drawing from the cases that you hear about. So that case that you mentioned, I try not to draw too much from. But one thing that I did, this was the boy who was stabbed in the bathroom, the freshman who was stabbed by a senior. Jonathan Cochran was the name of the case. And the one detail that from that book that did slip through was the boy who was murdered. The last thing he said was, "Stop, you're hurting me." And I remember reading that and just thinking it was such a poignant, heartbreaking, ordinary thing to say. And so I put those words in Ben Rifkin's mouth in this book, only because it was just too, it was so powerful in the very ordinariness of what he said that I couldn't stay away from it. So yes and no. Yes, you're using these cases, and you're trying to stop yourself from using them at the same time for just that reason. The defense lawyer is based on I hate to say this because it based on means that you start from the guy, not that it's a portrait of the guy. But it's true. It started off as a guy, a wonderful, prominent, terrific lawyer named Jonathan Shapiro, who happens to be the husband of Hank Phillippe Ryan, who did the panel here a few weeks ago, who is a wonderful man. And I'll tell you that when you, as a prosecutor, you have a sort of charged, fraught attitude toward defense lawyers who sometimes seem to have a very casual relationship to the truth. And when you leave, when you age out of the DA's office, assuming you're not going to be a career prosecutor, and it's just a numbers game, most prosecutors can't be. So when you reach that point where you're going to move on from the DA's office, there is that big question whether you're going to go to the criminal defense side, because that's where your expertise is. You are by then a criminal trial lawyer. And it's hard for some DAs to make that transition. A buddy of mine from the office couldn't do it. And what he always said was, they have a right to a lawyer, but they don't have a right to me. And he went off and he just practiced a different kind of law, which really meant stepping back and starting from scratch and learning a whole new field. So when I left the DA's office, I had some of these attitudes about defense lawyers, and meeting Jonathan really turned me around because he's such a good, decent, kind, intelligent man that it was impossible to maintain any of these caricatures about these guys. And so I really admired him. And so he snuck into the book that way. As far as the lawyers, I would not say Andy Barber is me. I'd like to think Andy Barber is what I might have become if I stuck to it. But there are older lawyers like that who, you know, as a young guy starting out, you look up to them and you are influenced by them, and you do try to model yourself after them and learn from them.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'd like everybody to join me in thanking William Landay for spending the evening